counseling. Now, counseling started up. It sounds like counseling psychology. You say, well, what difference could there be? But there's quite a bit of a difference. Counseling started up separately in its own department. Now, sometimes it would have developed in the education department and it would have been school counseling. And then slowly they became their own. And oftentimes they'll be called the School of Counseling or the School of Mental Health Counseling or something like that. And they become their own departments. And really they became big because a lot of people didn't want to get a PhD. And it's like, that's a lot of work to get a PhD. And I think we should be able to provide services at the master's level. So that became, quite honestly, it became a battle because it became a turf battle. Who's going to take over doing therapy when psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists had been doing the therapy? Now counseling wanted to come in and do that. And so there became a little bit of a turf war there. And it's still present. There's always that, well, who can do this best? I will tell you, the research indicates if you get good training, any of the degrees that I'm talking about can provide adequate counseling. Now, most of the testing ends up being done by psychologists because psychologists are trained a lot in testing. So most of them is done there. But there are even educational specialist degrees. You can get master's degree in that. So there are other areas for you. But if you want to do therapy, then counseling is certainly a fine choice. The entry level is master's degree. You can get a PhD, but almost everybody who gets a PhD is interested in going into academia. And since master's is the entry level meaning the level I need to get a license, that's what is most common in counseling. So you go to graduate school in counseling. Sometimes it's called clinical counseling. Sometimes it's called mental health counseling. There's variations across every university. It's not as consistent as it is in psychology. In psychology, you'll apply to clinical psychology program, or you will apply to counseling psychology program. There won't be any doubt about that. In counseling, the programs may be called a lot of different things, and you'll need to look at them because sometimes it's very clear. They'll be called, mental health counseling program. That that's what it is. It becomes clear that it's going to lead to your being licensed as a counselor. However, there are other ones that are less clear. I was talking with a student just a week ago, and she was looking at a program, and it was a master's in neuroscience. And the way they talked about the program, they were looking at mental health issues in neuroscience. That was a big focus of the program. But the program didn't have any courses that were going to lead towards being able to be licensed. So while that sounded like a great program, and indeed it is a great program, it's really a fascinating program she was looking at to get her master's, but it wasn't going to lead to what she wanted, which was counseling. So you got to pay close attention to that and see which, what does the program offer, and ask them if they are designed to help you get licensed to provide counseling services to people, mental health services. So graduate school counseling is typically a 2-year program. Sometimes it's longer than that, but typically 2 years. You need clinical experience. This can vary state to state, but typically it's 3,000 hours of supervised client services. Psychology, as I've already talked about, has these couple of years of full-time clinical work that focuses less on actual number of client contact hours. In this case, we're focusing on actual number of client contact hours here. So you can see 3,000 hours is going to take you a couple of years to be able to do that. So it takes a while as to when you get that. And sometimes that clinical experience, you can get a job. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes that ends up coming as volunteer. It really shouldn't. I think that, you're putting in services and officially you should get paid for it, but it's like there are some fields you're definitely going to get paid for. So like if you're in, computer science and you do an internship, even though you're not fully employed, they're going to pay you, and they're probably going to pay you a relatively good hourly rate. In mental health, you're probably not going to get that as much. It's like on the internship for psychology, you do get paid, but it's not a ton of money, but you do get paid enough to live. But that may not be true in this case. So keep that in mind. You'll have to check that out, and you'll want to talk to the schools to make sure that they are able to get you hooked up with appropriate clinical experiences even after you graduated. And finally, after you get those clinical hours in, you can become licensed as an LPC. Now, LPC means licensed professional counselor. Sometimes there are other degrees, and this is partly a problem, actually. See, one of the nice things about like psychiatry and psychology, if you're licensed as a psychiatrist, you're a psychiatrist. If you're licensed and you go to another state, you're not licensed at that state, but you get licensed and you get licensed as a psychiatrist. In clinical psychology, if you're in one state and you're licensed, if you go to the other state, you're not licensed yet. You have to get relicensed in the next state. But when you're licensed as a clinical psychologist. So it becomes very simple state to state. In counseling, it's not that way. It varies. While most states are LPCs, licensed professional counselors, you can have things like an LMHC, a licensed mental health counselor, okay, or a licensed clinical professional counselor. So they have different variations across states. So keep that in mind, that the name might not be the same, and you need to ask specifically, what's the licensure in this particular state?